Well, hey there and welcome back to my channel. And here's one of the big ones. We are going to look at the Napoleonic Wars, which lasted between 1803 and 1815. And if you need to review some vocab for the AP government curriculum, you might want to click right over here and grab that review packet. But if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it.
Okay,
So, before we talk about the wars themselves,
we gotta answer a kind of a big how.
how is it that Napoleon became such a big deal? Well, he rose through the ranks of the military during the French Revolution because he was a brilliant military tactician and strategist. Now, the revolution had produced a republic, but many of the old monarchical families in France were not pleased with this turn of events. So they tried to restore one of them to power by means of a coup, and Napoleon was the general who led this coup. Now, after seizing control of France, Napoleon did what many revolutionary leaders do. He went ahead and crowned himself emperor, and so the era of Napoleon ushered in the end of the French Revolution. And it also ushered in a new phase in which the ideals of the revolution would be spread across Europe. So what was that? Well, the French Revolution had been about a lot of things, but chief among those things was the idea of nationalism, right? Think liberty, equality, fraternity. And so when Napoleon conquered various parts of Europe, he spread these ideals and helped foster the growth of nationalist movements throughout the continent. So we're talking about Germany, Italy, Poland, even Russia. All of these places had a kind of awakening where people began to think of themselves first and foremost as belonging to an ethnic group with a common culture, language, and history. In other words, a nation. Okay, now while Napoleon was spreading nationalism around Europe like the plague or something, he was also busy reorganizing the continent. So as he conquered different areas, he established a kind of new order. He set up satellite states like the Confederation of the Rhine that were subservient to French interests. And he also enacted a series of administrative reforms that were pretty progressive for their day. For example, he created a metric system and standardized weights and measures throughout his empire. He also implemented the Napoleonic Code, which was a comprehensive set of laws that went down in history for its progressive attitude toward property rights and secularism. It also, however, imposed really harsh punishments on crimes against the state. Now, all of this reshaping of Europe happened as a result of warfare. And as I said earlier, warfare is what these Napoleonic Wars were all about. So let's talk about that, all right? So, Napoleon's wars can basically be broken into three phases. The first phase was from 1803 to 1806, and it was characterized by a war against the coalitions of Europe. So what was that? Well, remember, Napoleon had taken over France and made himself emperor, and the other great powers of Europe were not cool with that, so they formed coalitions against him. But despite being outnumbered, Napoleon defeated them, and that success brought about the Peace of in 1806 and the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. Both of these treaties did two things. First, they recognized Napoleon's dominance on the continent, and second, they divided Europe into two spheres. You had the French sphere, which included most of Western Europe, and then you had the Russian sphere, which dominated everything to the east. Okay? Now, this second phase of the Napoleonic Wars, which took place between 1808 and 1812, was characterized by a war with Spain and Portugal, but mostly a disastrous invasion of Russia. Let me explain. So Portugal had refused to join Napoleon's continental system, which was essentially a blockade of England designed to destroy its economy. And so Napoleon sent an army to invade Portugal, but first, he needed to stop the Spanish from providing supplies to the Portuguese. So he marched his army into Spain, and the Spanish people were like, "No, thank you." So Napoleon's army fought against Spanish guerrillas, and they lost badly. They just couldn't handle the type of warfare that was being waged against them. Meanwhile, Napoleon had also decided to invade Russia. And although his grand army of 600,000 men reached Moscow, the Russians had already evacuated the city and burned it down. So Napoleon's army spent a miserable winter there, and they were decimated by cold and starvation. By the time they got back to France, only a few thousand soldiers were still alive. Okay, now, the final phase of the Napoleonic Wars, which took place between 18 and 1815, was marked by a sixth coalition against Napoleon and resulted in his final defeat. Here's how it went down. So once Napoleon returned to France, he tried to recruit more men to his army, but this proved difficult because most of the able young men had been killed off in the prior 10 years of warfare. And so this shortage of manpower doomed his last bid for glory. The British defeated Napoleon's navy and sealed off France completely. And then Prussia and Austria invaded France itself. Napoleon abdicated in 1814 and was exiled to Elba, an island off the coast of Italy. Then he escaped and briefly returned to power in what was called the 100 Days' War. But he was decisively beaten at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled for good to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. Okay, so let's finish by talking about why all this is so significant. And there are 3 big reasons. First of all, the Napoleonic Wars demonstrated the power of nationalism as a unifying force. Right? Napoleon appealed to nationalist sentiments in order to build support for his wars. And the wars themselves helped to strengthen those same nationalist feelings in France and throughout Europe. Second, the Napoleonic Wars helped to bring about the end of the Holy Roman Empire. So, remember, one of the big shifts in world politics during the 18th century was the increasing power of the Ottoman Empire. Right? But the HRE was unable to prevent any of the other states in Europe from gaining power. Not Prussia, not Russia, not France. And so the HRE, which was not dissolved until 1806, was essentially irrelevant by this point, and the reason that is important is because it meant that the political map of Europe was completely reorganized. Remember, going into the 19th century, Europe was dominated by a bunch of fairly weak states, but by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it was dominated by a whole bunch of new strong states, including Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and France itself. And third, the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars led to an era known as the Concert of Europe. The goal of this concert was to maintain the balance of power in Europe and prevent another Napoleonic Wars. To that end, the great powers of Europe met regularly at these congresses to make decisions about the future of Europe, and they essentially agreed to uphold the status quo and prevent any one nation from becoming too powerful. Okay, that's what you need to know about the Napoleonic Wars. Click right over here to grab a view packet. If you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, and I am glad we got to hang out for a few minutes, and I will catch you on the flip-flop. I'm out!